Thank you again for joining me tonight for a reading by award-winning author Julie Weston from Miner's Moon, the fourth book in her Nellie Burns and Moonshine mystery series. Julie grew up in Idaho and practiced law in Seattle, Washington. Her memoir of Place, The Good Times Are All Gone Now, Life, Death, and Rebirth in an Idaho Mining Town, which was published by University of Oklahoma Press, received honorable mention in the 2009 Idaho Book of the Year Award. Julie's short stories and essays have been published in Idaho Magazine, the Three Penny Review, River Styx, and the Rocky Mountain Game and Fish, among other journals and magazines. Her mysteries, all published by Five Star Publishing, have won awards. Moonshadows was a finalist in the May Sarton Literary Award. Basque Moon won the 2017 Willa Literary Award in Historical Fiction, and Moonscape placed third in the Forward Indies Award. She and her photographer husband, Gary Morrison, live right here in central Idaho, where they ski, write, photograph, and enjoy the out of doors. So please join me in welcoming Julie Weston.
Thank you, everyone, for coming, and thank you, Kristen. That was a great introduction, and reminds me that I'm an Idahoan, and I sometimes forget that, but because I lived in Seattle for so long. And I realize tonight is the first night of the committee hearings. We're taping them, or recording them, I guess you call it. I'm sorry. You're missing it, but it's probably going to be played everywhere again later, so I hope you get a chance to see it. And maybe we don't really want to see them, I don't know. We'll see how it goes. It might be really boring. I'm delighted to be here at the Haley Public Library. The last time Gary and I came with our book, The Magical Universe of the Ancients, and we were in a room upstairs and there was nobody around, and we were just having our program recorded because it was during the pandemic. And it was so strange to be talking, and I don't think we had, we did have some slides, but there was nobody there to look at, there was nobody there to fall asleep, there was nobody there to smile. So I'm used to people falling asleep. I'm just not used to having nobody in front of me. So those of you who golfed 18 holes today can go to sleep if you want, Janet. I was just here the other night with Mike Medberry, and I'm so delighted to have this place for us to come to, and the new audiovisual equipment. It's much easier and much more friendly place than upstairs at the library, which I think was part of the city building. I can't remember, Kristen. So thanks for inviting me here. I did bring the kind of camera that Nellie Burns would have used, and it's over there on the table if you want to stop and look at it afterwards. Several of you have seen it before. It's an old-fashioned, large format type camera. I knew virtually nothing about it. Gary gave me all his expert advice. And so nearly everything that's in the books about the camera and taking photographs with it is accurate. But I must say, Gary would tell me how it worked. I'd write it down, and then I'd show it to him again, and he'd say, that's not right. So he'd change it again, or change it, and then I'd do it again. So it always went through several permutations of how the camera worked in the book. So I think it's right now, but you'll have to ask Gary. Tonight I'm going to talk a little bit about mining. I grew up in a mining town, Kellogg, Idaho, in the Panhandle. And the kind of people I knew there are reflected in the book that I wrote, and also in my memoir of The Good Times Are All Gone Now. It was a wide open town, gambling and prostitution and all sorts of excitement went on in the town. But everybody was friendly and helped take care of each other. My dad was a doctor in the local hospital. And I was reminded of this morning when I read the newspaper, and somebody wrote a letter to the editor about how people in Ketchum and this valley take care of each other. When something bad happens, they have fundraisers, they provide food, they provide books to kids. And that's the kind of town I grew up in too. So this feels like home, much more so than Seattle did, and I lived there a long time. I'm going to go through some slides that give you a little history of mining and some of the things that are found in this new book, Miner's Moon, and what I base some of the story on. Like prohibition, mining, and then afterwards, after I read a couple little sections, we'll do a question and answer period if you want. We should finish a little around 6:30 maybe. Okay, the slides. All my books have moon in the title, so I always bring a photograph that Gary took of the moon. I think that was taken from Indian Creek. And so far, I think it's on the front cover of 3 of them, and I'm hoping it will be on every cover because I have moon in the title. I do have a new book in process. It's at the publishers. It's called Moon Bones. It's set again in the Haley area and Stanley Basin, and involves the 2 Chinese characters who are in the first book, if you've read the books. Hi, Tony. The characters in the book are Nellie Burns, who is a photographer, Moonshine, her black lab dog, Sheriff Asgo, he's a Basque sheriff, which most of you recognize would not have ever been the case in this valley, but because it's fiction, I can do what I want. There's also Rosie, who is a retired miner. He was hurt in a mining accident and has only one eye. Nellie and Moonshine and the sheriff and Rosie all end up in North Idaho. They're called up there because of Prohibition. And Prohibition became effective in Idaho in 1916. So it was earlier than most of the other states, and it became a national program in 1919, which was effective on January 20th. Women received the vote via the 19th Amendment in 1920. Often women are blamed for Prohibition, but they didn't even get the vote until after it became effective, just to let you know. The U.S. rejected the League of Nations in 1919 after the First World War. So even then we were not always real friendly to our global friends. Maybe in 1922, Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin all began their political careers. And in 1920, there were race riots in Chicago. So the more things change, the more they stay the same, I think. In 1922, King Tut's tomb was discovered, and in the same year, Little Orphan Annie appeared in the comic pages of newspapers, just to kind of set the time period. My books all take place in 1923 and 24 so far. The next one's in 1925. Jazz was also becoming part of the music of the country then, with Duke Ellington, Louis Armstrong, and Al Jolson. And along the same lines of the more things change, the more they stay the same, Twin Falls had an amalgamated sugar bit plant in Twin Falls in 1917 with 250 workers, 12-hour shifts to grind and prepare beets from 7,000 acres. In 1918, they imported Hindu laborers from India. So even then, refugees and immigrants were working in Twin Falls. This time, I think they're at the dairy plants. They were in the sugar business then. I love this quote. It's from Jane Kirkpatrick, who's a writer from Oregon. Landscapes carve us, they shape us, and I suspect we choose a landscape not only where we grew up, but because there is a draw to the vision, the sound and sense of these places. And we all are living in this mountainous country, in this beautiful valley, and those things all carve us, and they certainly did for me. And in this book where mining takes place, is part of my history and part of the whole history of the state of Idaho. There was lots of mining in the whole state, so I thought that was particularly pertinent. This painting was by my mother. She did it in 1960 when I was probably a junior in high school. It's the front of my book. The good times are all gone now. But I think in the 1920s, this is probably what the town, which I call Bitterroot, not Kellogg, in the book looked like. This was a smelter. This little area in the middle, there were houses in here, and in the 70s, the kids who grew up in those houses were found to have lead poisoning. And this was down below, close to where the tailings ponds were, and we used to ice skate in a place just like this, with tree trunks and probably leaking from the tailings ponds. It was called the slough. And in the winter it froze over, so we skated around the tree trunks like that. Labor, union problems began really early on in North Idaho. I'm not sure there were many labor problems here, but in North Idaho, the miners hijacked the train up near Burke, Idaho, above Wallace, and they took it down all the way to Kellogg, and they blew up the mill. They dynamited it. They had 50 crates of dynamite that they set, and they just blew the whole thing up. And after that, anybody in town who had a gun was arrested and put in a concentration camp. Eventually, they were all let go, and nobody was ever really prosecuted for it. But it set the tone, and there were labor troubles for the whole rest of the time, including the time I lived there. The other thing that went on in Kellogg, which I call Bitterroot, and Wallace and Mullen, was the selling of liquor, mostly through bootlegging. This cartoon was in a magazine in 1920, and every sign has something to do with bootlegging. The sign at the bottom middle here talks about the company that makes liquor, and then there's trucks that are loaded with barrels of liquor that are going out to all the mining communities. And this whole area looks very much like Burke, Idaho did before it ended, which was in the 60s or 70s. So it was a major deal in Idaho. This was the entrance to the mine that I talk about in the book. It goes back, you go in on a transportation about 2 miles, and then you get to the point where you can go down into the mine. But you can see even the 2 miles takes you into these mountains. There are still hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of tunnels down there. This level is the 9th level in the mine because the 1st through 8 are up above. This is how the men got into the mine in the earlier years. They rode these carts that took them in. Later, when I went in, I was in what looked like a Walt Disney travel car. It was just one car that held 2 to 4 men. But this is how they got in for much of the time during when my book takes place. This is how you get down deep into the mine. Once you get in that 2-mile trip on the cart, you get in this, what they called a pickle barrel, because they look like pickles stacked all the way up. And there were little wooden wedges that you sat on. It was quite a scary experience. And it was at about a 45-degree angle. There really weren't things to hang on to, and when I went down, the man who went down with me said, "Don't put your arms out, you'll get cut off." This was a newer picture than the 1920s, but this is the way men got into the mine to work. And it would stop at the different levels and let the miners off. So when I refer to a pickle barrel, this is what it would have been. Most mines had cages that went straight up and down vertically. For instance, the Sunshine Mine, where the big fire was in 1972 and 91 men were killed, had cages that were on top of each other, and they would load men and they'd be all crowded together, and then it'd go down a little bit, and then the next cage would be filled and it'd go down, and they'd be going down according to where they were going to get off, which is kind of the order in which they got into the pickle barrel. I did go down the main mine in the town, which in my book I call the Gem Mining Company, but it was the Bunker Hill and Sullivan mine. In the left picture, whoops, well, I screwed that up there. In the left picture, I'm in the 9th level, which was entering the mine. And this was near a place where dynamite was stored. And in the right photograph, I'm down at the lowest level, which was level 23, and I was more than a mile down. You probably can't tell it, but I was very, very nervous. And the man who was taking me through the mine was a teacher who turned miner so he could earn more money. Said, "Let's go to another area called a stope where they were doing mining." And I said, "No, I would really like to go up, please." And they called the sled and took me up again. What I'm wearing is a digger, which was a full jumpsuit kind of thing. It was they found the smallest one they could find, because mostly men worked in the mine. And then around my waist was the self-rescue unit, which they didn't have in the 1920s. They had something that would help. It looked more like a gas mask you saw during the World War I. You may have seen it on movies or something, with kind of a snout on it. But mostly those weren't very available. And then my light, which you can see on my helmet, on the right picture at the top, was just an ordinary light and the battery was also around my waist. During the time of the book, in the 1920s, it was a carbide light, which it'd be on the top of a hat or a helmet, and you'd put water on it and light it, and that's how it burned. It burned like a light, like a candle, but the more water you put on, the bigger the flame was. And if your hands got close to it, you could be burned, or your hair might be burned. So it was not something comfortable to use, but I'm sure the men got really used to it.
Julie, when were those pictures taken?
These were taken in 1990. The mines opened around the 1880s, closed in 1980, largely because of labor problems and the EPA. And then they opened again briefly in 1990. And that's when I went down, and they were limited operations. For instance, at level 23 is not as low as it used to be opened. It used to go down to level 26 or 27. And each level is about 150 to 200 feet below the next one. Right outside of Kellogg, or Bitterroot, there is a crystal gold mine. And there's the left picture is the original entrance in 1880. And somebody destroyed the entrance. And there's a similar situation in the book. But they found it again about 20 or 30 years ago. And it's now a commercial enterprise where you can go into the mine, you walk in and you can see what the tunnels are like, and there's actually some gold in they show where you would find gold. Here are some of the tools that men used, and here is what an ore car looked like in that mine. This was a little smaller than the ones I had seen in the gem mining company. It's really an experience to go in. The other place that's kind of fun to go to is the Idaho State Historical Museum in Boise. They have a setup of a mine and you go through a tunnel. And it's so much like it really was like for me when I was in. It's always kind of wet and it was very warm. Partly because we were inside so long. Gary took this photograph of the mining equipment that I used when I was in. And I just thought, there's a self-rescuer on the right side of the picture here. And then here, this is the battery for the light. You can see the cord on the left. You can see the cord going up to the light. In my town, there were 2,000 or more miners. And so the town itself was maybe 4,000 or 5,000. But there were mines all up and down the valley, so the total miners were probably 4,000 to 5,000 men. And men would work there their whole lives, and then their sons would start working and they'd work there their whole lives. And then the next generation would start up. So they were grandfathers and grandsons, sometimes working in the same mine at the same time. That was particularly evident in the Sunshine Mine Fire when 91 men were killed. I got a newsletter from the local mining museum the other day, and they listed all the people who were killed. And there were whole families. There were 2 or 3 people who, with the same last names, and the years were such that there was a parent, a son, and a grandson. Come on in. Just showing slides about mining, and this is a chute that goes down vertically. It looks like it might be you'd walk in on the level, but you don't. See the ladders? You can see the letters there on the lower left. And to get into the mining area, which is called a stope, S-T-O-P-E, you take these ladders down. And then you carry ore up here through this sled that comes up, and then it's put into ore carts. And this is moonshine. This isn't really moonshine, but it's a dog that belonged to our granddaughter, and he was so much like the moonshine that we owned, Gary and I, and lived with us until he. And that was a she, but she wasn't big enough to do some of the things Moonshine does in books. So I needed a male, and I wanted you to see what he looked like. And since we've had snow recently, I thought a snow picture would give you the picture of Mooney. Yes?
Can I ask the question about the slide before?
Sure.
There's a ladder, and then it looks like a claw. What is it? Thing on the right.
That's pulling up the ore.
Is it like a giant bucket?
Yeah.
So someone would load that
Down below, yeah.
So
and there'd be a pulley.
This shaft runs through every single level, and it's used to
It's
bring
not.
the stuff out?
This only goes from one level to the area between the next level.
Oh.
And then the next level would have more of these. And there's a whole bunch of different mining places on each level.
Wow.
And where they mine is called a stope. I should have a picture of one of those, but I don't. And I'll read you part of the book that tells how you get down and what it's like, which I took from my own diary. Okay, I'll leave it there on the chute, and then read you a little bit from the book. You remember, this is a murder mystery, just to warn you. Blood oozed like liquid glue down the side of the mine sled. Men, some scorched, others gashed, were tied to the sled walls so they wouldn't slip and fall down the shaft, as if they weren't dead or nearly so already. A few others sat up, their hands gripping the sides, their eyes glowing white surrounded by dirt or oil. Their faces were set in the rictus of death, and yet their hands moved, their heads turned. How many are coming up? Nellie Burns glanced around the tunnel where she stood with Sheriff Asgo, her boss from her home in central Idaho. Lights glared near the cable, hauling in the mine sled, but the outer edges of the carved-out room in the mine felt threatening. They watched the manned sled pull up the main shaft to level 9, the mine's entrance level where they stood. She wanted to turn away, but it was her job to take photographs with her large format Primo camera, her almost constant companion, that camera over there. The cable creaked as it wrapped around a giant drum at the far end of the room. The heavy counterweight in the shaft sank down to what some thought was a pit of hell, but the supervisors called the lowest working level of the gem company mine. Even the smell of sulfur confirmed they might be dealing with the subject of one of Dante's circles. Nellie stepped aside to throw up, relieved to be wearing pants and not a dress. She cleaned her face with a handkerchief and returned to Sheriff Charlie's side. I don't know, he said. Tying the victims from the explosion to the sled must take time. Are you all right? Nell nodded, steadied her camera on its tripod, covered her head with a black cloth, focused on the tableau, pulled off the cloth, slid in the film holder, pulled out the dark slide, and waited to open the lens while she signaled to the deputy assisting her. All that information came from Gary, of course. He held the phosphorus in a tray ready to light. She lowered her hand. Floosh! Like lightning, the powder exploded. White light filled the cave, and she closed the lens. The circle of hell was now imprinted on film, a record of what they saw that day in the mine. Groans combined with shouts from the ambulance crews helping men out of the sled. Open ore cars, empty of rock, lined the tracks back to the outside, waiting for injured miners. Nellie saw that silent bodies were piled in one of the last cars. No hurry for its departure. After 3 additional photographs, and when no more men appeared from the depths, she hopped onto a smaller, flatter car like a railroad jitney that the sheriff flagged for her. She was so relieved to leave the mine, she didn't even thank him, just stepped down, holding her equipment close to her bosom. The sun sank toward the mountains, draining color from the bare areas of the mountain slopes opposite the mine entrance, the north side of the valley. The dirt stretches looked like so many scabrous patches of leprosy, surrounded by deep green evergreens that would soon be eaten up and swallowed by the gluttonous maw of the adit, the mine entrance. She shook herself, lifted her camera bag to her shoulder, and began to trudge up the street to the Uptown Hotel. As she walked, the mountains loomed around her. She found herself hunching from the strain of carrying the memory of inside the mine on her shoulders, just as she had felt there, aware of every level of earth above her. The contrast between this town and the south central Idaho area she now called home was stark, especially the sagebrush mountains around Haley and Ketchum. Her camera grew heavier as she approached the hotel, rumored to have women of the night in several rooms, soiled doves, as she had heard. That was certainly like Haley. Mining and sheep herding served as a local support, she gathered. She ruminated on taking photos of the women, if for no other reason, those portraits would be interesting because of the stories behind them. She wondered if the sheriff would object. She would use her own film, not the county's. As if conjured by her thoughts, he stepped behind her and opened the hotel door. This man, this Basque sheriff, an anomaly in itself, this former sheep herder, was the man she worked for, his crime photographer. "We must talk," he said in his slightly accented speech, a holdover from the Euskara language of his youth. "Alone, this situation is more complicated than the local authorities told the state police office." "You look exhausted," Charlie said to Nell, "and no wonder. That mine accident could cut out the heart of a strong man. When the local police asked me to go down and see what was going on, I did not know it would be like that." The sheriff paced. "Otherwise, I would not have taken you with me. Worse, it was no accident." "What do you mean?" The horror she had felt in the mine threatened her gorge again. "Someone, a miner, a superintendent, someone set off the dynamite and started the fire in the lower level. One of the burned men brought up a petrol can. He said the fire exploded right next to him. He was hurt but crawled to the hoist and signaled for a pickle barrel and relayed the fire alert." "How do you know this man didn't do it?" She straightened, the better to think. "We don't. He died. The company official who confirmed his tale said every single man who came out could have done it. So could any super or anyone else who had a grudge. He wants to blame it on the union. Said he'll call Pinkerton and get a private detective here. Then we can go home. Ketchum never felt so dear. We're supposed to investigate the scheme to violate the prohibition laws and possibly a federal murder, as we talked about on the way here, not this mine accident. That mine fire was just a diversion for us. We are involved because we happen to be in town." And the story goes on from there to many different adventures, including Nellie goes into the local madam's house and takes pictures of the women who worked there and of the madam and her 4-year-old daughter. There's another section where she goes into the mine. Nell and the sheriff walked with Rosie to the trains heading into the mine for the graveyard shift. She hoped no one would question her. She was back in her miner's dress, pants, jacket, hat to cover her hair, and boots, and had patted her cheeks with dust from a pile on the way up to the entrance from the main street. A moon tipped near the western horizon, its light so bright it turned the valley into a silver village, mimicking the lodes underground. A miner's moon, Nellie named it to herself. She wondered how many miners missed the moon, working all evening or all night. Lights were few and far between, but Nell could see portions of the tunnel, water dripping down and a myriad of pipes and wires along the sides. She wished she could ask what everything was for. Another engine with one more car followed hers and Rosie's. This third trip into the mine seemed easier than the earlier ones, even though their goals might be deadly. She wondered if Charlie felt the same way. This was his 4th or 5th trip. They had learned that somebody was going to set off another set of dynamite to hurt more miners and just hopefully to close down the mine. So Charlie and Rosie and Nellie got permission from the mining company to go into the mine during the night to see if they could find where dynamite might be stored. Another person who went with them was Buddy Rinaldi, who was a shifter, which means he was somebody who organized the various groups of men going to different mining places in the mine. So Nellie and Rosie get into that sled that goes down, the one called a pickle barrel. The pickle barrel, as Rosie called it, gathered speed. What if the cable broke? It took all of Nell's willpower not to cling to Rosie. She closed her eyes at first, but decided that was worse. If they were going to plunge to the bottom of the shaft, she wanted to know. Giant timbers over her head held the mountain in, out, up. After a short length, the sled slowed. The narrow shaft opened to a station, level 10, she breathed to herself. She was certain she would not be able to go any deeper. Rosie climbed out, and Nell stumbled after him. How did the cable operator know exactly where to stop? He was several hundred feet above them and completely out of sight. No matter, he knew his job well. Nell took another deep breath. The four of them began going down a drift, which is a tunnel underground, heading for one of the mining stopes. Nell followed Charlie, and finally they all arrived at a timbered hole in a niche in the ground. The hole was maybe 3 feet by 3 feet and surrounded by wood. Nell could see the top of a ladder with wood steps. Uh-oh. She didn't think she was going to like this at all. Rinaldi swung himself onto the ladder and began descending. Rosie followed once Rinaldi himself was out of sight, although a faint glow from his carbide light could be seen as she peered over the edge. There was no apparent end to the black below. Were they digging to China? I will go in front of you, Nell. Keep your face back and your hands on the sides. Otherwise, your light may burn you. He, too, swung onto the ladder and stepped down a couple of feet. If you have trouble, and you should not, I will be right below you to help. Do not worry. He patted the top step. Nellie mimicked him in her head. Do not worry. She had been worried from the moment she and the others had unloaded from the man car, whether she'd be discovered, whether they could find new explosives, whether she could keep up, whether this was one of the stupidest things she'd ever done. I must admit, I thought that when I went down the mine. Now she had to worry about climbing down in a hole in the ground, like a gopher or vole, or worse, losing her grip and falling. She kept expecting the ladder to end, but it didn't. Down and down, step after step. Her hands ached from grasping the ladder's sides. She called quietly down to Charlie. How deep are we going? There was no answer, and then a step under her boot cracked, and she almost lost her balance. Nell clung to the ladder sides and stopped, unable to force herself to step down again. Charlie's head appeared below her. I can't do this anymore, she said. You can, one step at a time. We should reach the stope in no time at all. I cannot see Rosie's light anymore. Nell began her slow descent again. Charlie waited for her at the bottom. Here you are. That was not so bad, was it? Nell wondered if he was reassuring himself. It was bad. Now what? She asked. Rosie and Rinaldi have moved into the stope to see if any dynamite is being stored there. The sheriff pointed to the black around them. 2 faint lights moved back and forth in the Stygian darkness. Nellie was thankful for her carbide light, even if she had scorched her hands once or twice when she leaned down to see if Charlie were right below her. He always was. Charlie took her arm and guided her toward the 2 men. Their own lights seemed bright in comparison. Nellie could see the rock walls, the dirt floor, the timber sets holding up the ceiling. Nothing gleamed like silver or gold that she could see. Probably lead didn't glow. She felt a shift in the air. Charlie, I'm going to stay here near the ladder. This doesn't feel right. The sheriff shrugged and said, all right, suit yourself. I will see if they are finding anything of moment. His light measured his progress in the mined-out stope. The rocks around felt as if it were a tunnel, which it was in a way. The miners followed the veins of lead and silver until they ran out or disappeared, going out, down or up. Nell regretted not following Charlie to see what the end of a stope looked like. She doubted she would ever get another chance. Still, This was similar to the Triumph mine, where she and Rosie had visited miners working, drilling and setting giant powder, as Rosie always called it. Maybe all mines were the same. This mine seemed much warmer, though. As she stood and listened, she could hear the faint voices of the men as they talked. Maybe they had found something. Nell sensed the air shift again, and then the ground under her feet lurched sideways. Dust filled the air in the direction she was looking. She grabbed the ladder and climbed 2 steps. A man came running from the back of the stope. Rinaldi. Silence. And then the mountain cracked. And the rest of the story is in the book. I must say it was fun to write this one because I really did use a lot of my journals from when I went down in 1990. So thank you. It was very much like the town I grew up in. And I never did go in the Triumph mine, but I wrote about it in Moon Shadows. And I could use the information from the bunker mine when I wrote about the Triumph mine and the train coming along.
She's crazy.
Julie, could you repeat the question, please?
I was asked, why did I go down the mine? And I went down because I was just beginning to take writing classes at the University of Washington. I'd been practicing law a long time, and I decided to do some writing, and I took this certificate program. And I thought, well, I should write about the mine. And then a man who worked for my parents said he'd take me down. So it was kind of put up or shut up. And so I went down and actually went in, and he went off to talk to friends, and he'd lined up this man who was a school teacher who was now a miner who took me down. And we visited lots of different things, and it was fascinating. I saw the men working and drilling, and I didn't see anybody setting dynamite, fortunately. So,
I went in the Clayton mine in the 70s.
Where's the Clayton mine?
Clayton, on the way up to Chalice.
Uh-huh.
And it was wet in there, and the water was pouring in, and we were told that it was like a fire hose. If it hit you in the face, it would tear your eye out. But in your book, I don't remember too much about it being wet. Were these mines less wet?
Well, the question is about whether the mine is wet as the Clayton mine. There was water seeping down the sides, and when we walked along the various drifts, I mean, it was very wet. It was slushy, and it would be easy to fall, or so you had to walk carefully and see what you were doing. You were also being warned not to touch the wire ahead of you, over you, because that would electrocute you. Because they used electrical transportation to bring the ore out and to take men in. And so it must just have to do with where it is. Clayton mine, which I don't know, might be much higher than it was in Kellogg, which was about 3,500 feet altitude in the town itself, and then the mines went way down, and some of the higher levels too.
Because I know in Triumph, there's still water pouring out of that.
Yeah, there is. And once they stopped mining in North Idaho, they said and they pumped for years afterwards, and then finally they gave up and said it's never going to open again. They'll just let it flood, and it does eventually flood. And now they're talking about opening it again, and I have no idea how they'll get the water out of there, because it has to be filled with water at this point. And you're pretty far down, so the water table must just seep in and over again. So, any other questions?
Yes. I wondered about the shot of the mine blown up. Did you say that was
1899. That was a mill. It was outside. That's where they'd take all the mine rocks, and then they'd refine it there. First they'd go through a rock house and smash it down, and then they'd send it into the mill. But
Blew that out of why?
because they wanted to get more than $3 a day. They had been making $3.50 a day, and then the mines cut them all back to $3 a day, which is what the muckers made. They're the ones who shoveled it out. So the question was, why did they do this? And they did it to get more money, because they were paid very poorly, and they spent 10 to 12 hours a day in the mine. And the unions were the ones that finally got them better pay. They were paid from the minute they got to the mine and got out, instead of when they got to their work spot, which was probably a half an hour, 45 minutes, and then longer to get out. They got safety equipment, but the safety equipment kind of came last. But there were labor troubles all the way through, and when I was in high school, I worked for a lawyer in the town who was hired by a bunch of miners to form a new union during a 9-month-long strike. And the new union ousted the old union at the end of that 9-month-long strike. And the attorney I worked for was kind of reading the law books as he was getting ready for various elections. He had not done labor law before, but it was a fascinating experience. And that's why I went to law school. So. Ted?
I was curious about Bunker Hill. You said it reopened in the 1990s?
It did, very briefly.
Oh, and what happened to it? Why didn't it continue?
I don't know. I think they still couldn't take care of the poisons that were coming out into the air and into the land.
So it's still closed?
It is still closed, but they're working on opening it again. I read about it whenever I see a headline somewhere that says something about the bunker.
And that's part of the extraordinary silver mining lode in North Idaho, right?
That was the Sunshine Mine,
Okay.
which was the main silver mine in the whole country for many, many years.
So I guess Bunker Hill was a subsidiary of Sunshine?
They were two different companies. Bunker Hill was lead and silver and zinc. But lead was the primary metal, and lead and zinc were lead and silver were the other smaller amounts of metal in with the lead. Tony?
Yeah, thanks, Julie, for the work that you do. It's so entertaining and educational.
Thank you, Tony.
I'm curious about mystery writing. It's not something I do, but this combination of personal memoir that you pull together these characters, these really fun characters like Nellie and Moonshine and Sheriff. I'm just curious how you plot a mystery story. Do you work with a sort of plan early on, or do you explore characters? You had some hints that certain bad guys might be responsible for the mine, but it's uncertain. How do you hold that suspense? Do you plan it all out? Do you surprise yourself along the way?
I do surprise myself. The question was doing mystery writing. Do I plan it out ahead of time? There are terms for any novelist writer is a pantser or a plotter. Pantser is you go by the seat of your pants, and a plotter is somebody who outlines and has it all figured out. I'm the first, not the second. What I do is find the place, and then things in the place are what inspire the book. For instance, Last Chance Ranch in the first book, Gary and I were out one winter. We'd gone for a moonlight dinner at Galena, and we came back down and stopped at Last Chance Ranch because Gary had always wanted to take a photograph of it in the moonlight. And of course, this was a full moon dinner kind of thing, so there was lots of light. And we crawled through the fence, and he set up, he had a camera larger than this one, but a large format camera. Got the tripod out and set it all up, and I was wandering around looking at Last Chance Ranch. And I turned to him, I said, I bet there's a dead body in there. and he looked at me, he says, why do you think that? I said, I don't know, it just seems like there might be. And some dogs started barking, so we got the hell out of there. But that's the kind of thing that happens. And I knew always that I was going to do a mystery set in the North Idaho mines. I just needed to get past some other things, because there was a place in the mine that was a perfect place for a murder or an accident or something, and it's in the book. And I'm not spoiling it by telling you, Sue.
You don't get to know it, do you?
You'll know when you get there. And then Craters of the Moon was the third one. And Gary and I have been out there any number of times, and you see those caves and you think, oh my God, there could really be something going on in some of these caves. And so that's how I start a book. And then I got, started with my characters, Nellie and Rosie and the sheriff and some other people. And they just kind of do what they do. And they kind of work off each other, and they get mad at each other, and it just, it's really fun. It's much more fun than nonfiction. I highly recommend it. So, anything else? Thanks for coming.
Thank you.
I really appreciate you being here.